excited to come back. I prepared many slides, but really I feel like it's often more useful, for me anyway, to think about presentations like this more as a conversation about work in progress. So that's what I brought in, which means that I'm infinitely interruptible. And I am going to talk today about my newest project that is about computing and mathematical thinking, but I have lots of other projects that are about overlapping and turn off your own phone. About other projects too, and so there's lots of points of intersection. So really, like, it's fine with me if we don't get through all these slides. I'd rather just have a conversation about what is interesting to all of you. I did try to do a little data collection about the kinds of things that folks are doing in the doctoral program, so I can understand what kinds of things I need to go into more background about and what things I might be redundant. So just interrupt if there's something that seems like an assumption or doesn't make sense. Vanderbilt's doctoral program, I know, has a really different way of thinking about mathematics than is often happening here at Georgia, so we have a lot of different conversations. So I'm happy to talk about all of those things. I am in Math Ed and Learning Sciences, but one of the things to share about that is that my version of Math Ed is a little bit different. So I don't study nuances in the ways that kids think about particular mathematical ideas. I study the kinds of mathematical experiences and contexts that we develop for kids. So that has a lot to do with kids' mathematical thinking, but isn't only about mathematical thinking. And that's why I'm in the learning sciences just as much as I'm in Math Ed, just to give it a little context. So I wanted to just start by situating the broader enterprise of my work. And I almost always have this slide in any talk I've given for the past 15 years, because it continues to be the enduring question that drives my research. So this is an interview exchange from a very old study now that Jill Bulwer did, where she was trying to understand the impact of different kinds of teaching on students' mathematical experiences. And at the end, she asked them, what did you think about your GSE exam, which is sort of the school leaving exam in England? And she found that kids in one school said something that was kind of like this. Sometimes, I suppose, they put it in a way which throws you. But if there's stuff I actually haven't done before, I'll try and make as much sense of it as I can, and I'll try to understand it as best as I can. So that was kind of great, right? I'm confused. I try to work through it. Kids at the other school say something kind of different. So same question, well, you can get a trigger. Like when the teacher says simultaneous equations and graphs. When they say that, you know it pushes that trigger. It tells you what to do. And Joe asked, well, what happens in the exam if you haven't got that? And he says, you panic. So to me, the question of why or how to support kids to develop this kind of relationship with mathematics instead of that kind of relationship with mathematics is what drives everything that I do in my work. And in fact, we have a lot of ways of thinking about how that develops, right? How is it that we develop particular kinds of relationships? Joe calls them relationships with mathematics. Other people call them identities in relation to mathematics or dispositions in relation to mathematics. It's all about the ways you think about and do mathematics. So what do we know? We know that math classrooms have cultures. They are not a culture-free space. And those cultures and practices communicate a tremendous amount of information to students, even tacitly, right? We're not usually announcing this stuff to kids. So usually, not always, but often school math involves a set of practices that emphasize a single right answer, practicing procedures, memorizing those procedures, solving things quickly, emphasizing answers over strategies, or insisting that there's one best way or one right way. And when you do when you engage these kinds of mathematics practices, this has both informational affordances for kids thinking and interpersonal affordances for kids thinking, which means that if mostly what you're having an opportunity to do is practice procedures with mathematics and get quick at math, it limits the kinds of mathematical thinking you ultimately get to engage. Likewise, it turns out that some people are really good at remembering things quickly and other people aren't. And when you give that kind of simple comparison and make it available in the classroom, you start to make assumptions about who you are in relation to math, if you happen to not be somebody who's good at thinking about things quickly. But we know that doing things quickly is kind of unrelated to actually rich mathematical thinking. So when we engage these kinds of practices in classrooms, we make available a way of thinking about ourselves that has very little to do ultimately with sophisticated mathematical thinking. So these practices have huge implications for the kinds of people and the kinds of thinkers we're developing in our classrooms. So really what a lot of people, not just myself, would say that when we think about how mathematical identities or mathematical relationships develop, it's this cycle in a classroom that has to do with the ways that what it means to do math gets locally constituted in a space and how that influences the ways that people are perceived. And these things cycle in. I was telling people, so I've now recently become the dean of first-year students at Vanderbilt, which has been eye-opening. Because mostly what they do is come and complain to me about the ways that math is taught, because they think I have something to do, like I could possibly do about it. And sadly, there's nothing to be done that I could do. But what I do is spend most of my time telling them about how learning is a joint accomplishment. And so the story usually goes something like this. Crying. I used to be really good at math. I was always really good at math, and now I've come to Vanderbilt and I'm horrible at math. Wow, what a difference a month can make, right? So, well, what's happening in your math, in your calculus? It's usually calculus. What's happening in calculus that makes you think you're bad at math? Well, what almost always goes on is a description of incoherence in relation to both the lecture and the discussion section, a TA or a graduate student who's not approachable. I'm going to office hours, it still doesn't make sense. I'm suddenly bad at math. And so most of what I spend my time doing is saying, you are not bad at math. You are not understanding the ways that things are being taught right now. There's mutuality to that, right? How do we think about why suddenly math is hard for you? It's not that Vanderbilt's so special, except that these people don't know how to teach, right? That's what's special. So to think about that and to reframe mathematics experiences as mutual, it doesn't necessarily transform their experience, but it gives them a different way to think about why would I give up or not, and why would I persist or not. If you believe I have suddenly become magically overnight bad at math, that influences the decisions you might make. If instead you believe, I really ended up with a really, a novice TA or a graduate student who hasn't taught before, or I haven't been able to communicate with this TA what I'm confused about, that's a much more empowered message that would be less likely to lead you to give up. And we know that the folks who have a harder time advocating for themselves are folks who are generally not white men, so like everyone except, right? So those are a lot of the issues that we have, and a lot of the issues that we see happening in K-12 schooling as well. And that's really a thing that I worry quite a bit about. So in order to make sense of all of this, I just want to pause to frame my work. So the perspective that I take on the world is an assumption that what happens to people is an interactive accomplishment. So we think about people and context as being interrelated and inextricable. So you can talk to people about what they think, of course, and that tells you some really interesting things, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what they're going to think when they're in the context of a much more complex environment. And in fact, when we think about the ways that people develop mathematical identities, we really think across multiple levels of interaction. So there's what happens in the classroom and the ways that classroom interactions influence how you're positioned, but that also has to do with the frames that are available in that space. What counts as being good at math? How do we know? And that again connects to the broader narratives in the world. So this idea that the first year students are bringing to me that I'm suddenly bad at math is connected to a really powerful narrative, right? Why are you bad at math? What makes you draw that conclusion? Well, because people who are good at math surely don't fail their test. People who are good at math don't go to this many office hours and still struggle to understand. Because we have narratives about mathematics, right? People who are good at math are fast at math. People who are good at math find math comes easily to them. Neither of those things are true right now. I suddenly have become not a math person. So it's really an interactive accomplishment between these broader societal narratives, how those narratives get made meaningful in the classroom, and then what happens in interaction between us. So these are perspectives on learning that have different names that are all kind of interrelated. So situative learning, sociocultural theory, ecological theory are all theories of learning that emphasize the interrelatedness of human activity. And those are the theories that help me make sense of the world and that guide my work. Nobody's interrupted. Any questions? So you might wonder, in fact I wonder about this all the time, like it's one thing to be able to identify what's problematic about kids' mathematical experiences, but what do you do? Like where do you go to make a change? So a lot of folks in math ed, including myself, think about the nature of the discipline, right? So they either think about the nature of the discipline in terms of what math could be, or like what math is, what kids' mathematical thinking actually looks like. But more broadly, people also think about the ways that the classroom activities that we design influence kids' thinking, how teaching practices could influence kids' thinking, and even how institutional context could influence kids' thinking. In my own work, I'm just about to realize that my I switched the order so my animations are going to be wrong. So my own work, I focused quite a bit on the nature of the discipline in terms of wondering what could mathematics be. So I have a project that's about the mathematics of textile art, for example, or another project that's called Playful Mathematics Learning that says, if we could get out of our own way about historically how school math has been taught, what could math look like? What are the possibilities? Let's go to places where we see really rich mathematical thinking happening and inquire about what happens there. It's kind of an ethno-mathematical approach. I also, this is where my animation is wrong. I also look a lot at classroom activities down here. And to think about the kinds of tasks that we develop and design that support kids to think about mathematics differently. The project I'm going to talk about today is actually at the intersection of the nature of the discipline and classroom activities, and it's a project called CAMPS. And CAMPS stands for Computing and Math Play Spaces. It's a project that's funded by the STEM plus C initiative from NSF. And usually I don't think the funding mechanism for grants is particularly interesting or relevant, but I wanted to take a moment to talk about it here because if you are a graduate student, then you might not know the ways that particular funding initiatives can influence and affect the work that you do. So STEM plus C is a newish NSF initiative. And for reasons that I'm still not entirely clear of, someone asked me to be on the review panel for one of the first STEM plus C grants. Of course, the math one. I didn't know anything about computer science. Still don't really actually know much about computer science. But and so I was on this panel, and what the early proposals were people who are really passionate about computer science, know a lot about computer science, and thought, you know what we should do? Math and computer science, they just beautifully dovetail. We're just going to put computer science into math classrooms, and that's what we're going to do. And it felt really problematic to me for a number of reasons. One is that it wasn't clear at all that the folks who were writing these proposals actually had ever been in schools, like since the last time they were students, and didn't really have a good sense of the kinds of pressures that teachers face. And also, it felt wildly premature. So while we have decades of literature to think about the ways that kids' mathematical thinking develops, we have exactly zero literature to think about the ways that kids' computer science thinking develops. So how do you know? I mean, I kept asking, like, why that thing? Why would you put that thing in third grade? How do you know? How do you know that the ways we think about data modeling and computer science actually complement in any way the ways we might think about computer science, data modeling in elementary school? Like, who knows? Why are you all saying that we're going to do this? It feels like wildly unethical, both to teachers and students. So I can get really worked up, and I did, and so we wrote a grant. And the grant was, stop the madness. We don't know one thing about what happens when you put computer science into math classrooms. I don't even know how you decide what to do. So let's study that. And that was apparently persuasive. The argument that we know nothing was a really persuasive reason to give us funding. And they did. And that's really what we've been up to. So this is an exploratory grant. So there's a lot of different kinds of grants at NSF. Exploratory is sort of the first level, and it says, we're not exactly sure what's going to happen, but we have some guesses about what we'd like to try. And that's what this project is about. So why would we think about math and computing is the first question. So it turns out lots of people actually have thought, and if you are a computer scientist or you do program, you would already know all the ways that math and computer science sort of can easily fit together. And in fact, in our field of folks who care about learning, there's actually been some work to think about what kinds of mathematical ideas can get leveraged when you're engaged in programming. But at the same time, we also know that the context and practices of different spaces dramatically influence how we know something. So we don't actually know what would happen if you learn a math concept in a computer science context, like how that would connect to what happens in math class. We don't really know the answer to that. But we know in other kinds of fields the answer to that, right? So when you try to teach math in a physics class, for example, the mathematics is different. It's contextualized differently than math in a math class. And we know transfer is tricky all the time, right? So it felt very facile to me to assume, as some did, that if I just put math in computer science, or I put computer science in math, that eureka, transfer will happen. So what we wanted to understand was something a little bit different, which is how mathematical thinking and computational thinking, in this case programming, might actually co-develop. And develop is maybe even too strong of a word. co-occur is probably actually the way we've ended up looking at it. What does it look like when kids are programming and thinking mathematically together? Is it a good thing? These are really sophisticated questions. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Do kids reject the mathematics? Do they run with the mathematics? Like, what happens when these two practices come together? And that's really what we've ended up doing in this grant. In particular, we've explored a little bit about like how foregrounding the mathematics or making it more or less salient to kids when they're programming, what difference that seems to make. We've thought about the ways we've positioned kids relative to the act of programming and how that influences the sophistication of their programming. And then, of course, we're always interested in the identities that kids develop in relation to programming.
A question. So when you say how you are foregrounding mathematics, tell me how you're thinking about the term mathematics. Are you thinking of the discipline mathematics? Are you thinking of children's ways of being mathematical?
It's more particular mathematical content, and I'll show you an example in a minute. But I would say that not the ways that kids are thinking about themselves as mathematical people, although we've talked about that quite a bit because originally that was, you write a grant and then you do the thing. But so originally what we imagined we would have is a programming camp that involved mathematical thinking, but like nobody really talked about it, and a math camp that involved computational thinking, but nobody really talked about it. And we were really curious about sort of explicitness and all kinds of things like that. And as we tried to develop these camps, we were really struggling with who is going to come to a math camp, and are those the kids, like, what are the questions that we have, and are those the kids that we want to work with? So we didn't ultimately make a math camp like that, but I do think that's a good question to ask about, like, later down the line. And I have some kinds of answers about that from interviews, but it's not a thing we've ultimately explicitly sort of looked at.
If you don't mind me just saying very briefly, the reason especially that I asked was I'm curious what might really start distinguishing computational or computer science thinking from how some people consider mathematical. So
yes. No, this is a huge question, dilemma, problem. So computational thinking has become, in my opinion, a term that is almost meaningless. So one of my students wrote her whole qualified paper on computational thinking and math and engineering, and I was reading this and like, can you just help me out? Because I am a novice to the computer science field. Like, this just sounds like problem solving to me. Help me understand how it's different. And then, related story, we have a computer scientist on the grant who doesn't know anything about math thinking. And she's like, I don't know, like, and I said, well, what do you think, Julie? Like, what would you think it would look like if we had computational thinking as you teach it in a math class? And she, like, described reform teaching. So it's, which she hadn't seen, but she could imagine, right? So I don't know what to say about computational thinking. So I'm talking about programming. But it's not because I don't think computational thinking matters, but in the way of many educational fads, it's become a term that everybody's pretty excited about for good reason, that it's not at all clear how you would actually ultimately understand what that term is doing. I mean, there's also a real passion about computer science unplugged activities, which are similarly confusing to me. So this field, if you are like, I feel like math ed is well understood and I want something new, come to computer science, because ask a question, we don't know the answer. So it's kind of exciting to be there. So I want to share a little bit about what we've done, and then I'll dig into a little bit of our data, which is like only lightly analyzed at this point. So we've run 2 camps. And because we're interested in issues of participation, we were really careful about how we thought about what kids were doing in these camps. So we didn't want to signal to anyone, this camp is not for you. And in other research that I've done, other projects that I've done, we know that the context or the story of the activity can like signal to kids like this is for you or not. And in fact, one thing that computer science has done nicely is actually study this very thing. So there's findings that, for example, in high school, like in AP computer science classes, if you decorate the room kind of as you think a computer science classroom would be decorated, like Star Trek posters and things, versus if you decorate a room in a way that's like a little more neutral, basically. It doesn't even have to be anti-Star Trek. People's sense of whether or not they can succeed in the class change dramatically, and girls in particular are more likely to think, oh yeah, I can do computer science if they're in the non-Star Trek-y classroom. So why is this? Well, it's probably a lot about the broader narratives that exist about who can participate and who this is for, right? So we've thought a lot about that and thought, well, what kind of programming are we going to do with kids? So it's very popular to do robotics with kids, but robotics tends to code and invite masculinity. It's also really popular in computer science to do e-textiles right now, which is really cool if you haven't played with it. They're washable, wearable little microprocessors that you can integrate into fashion and clothes. Those are really cool, but they also kind of code feminine. So we tried to find a way that was as open as possible. So we went with art, writ large, right? This is just an art camp, art and coding camp. And we had, in the first year, we had just 2 classes. Another sub-question of the grant, which I'm not going to talk about today, is like, what does a math teacher have to know in order to teach programming? Like, what is that like? Because that was another kind of unstated assumption in a lot of the grants. Like, math teachers will just teach programming. Okay, maybe. So we've been working with math teachers who were interested in and excited in learning about programming and thinking about possibly how they might integrate programming into their own math teaching. So we had 2 classes, we had 4 teachers, we paired them up, and it was a totally free camp. In the first year we had 30 kids. We did the same, well, we did a lot more in year 2. We doubled the size and added another module. All 4 teachers returned, which was like a measure of great success from my perspective, including one who flew back from Texas to come and teach again because he loved it so much. And then 4 more teachers, and we paired them up, which is like returning teachers, new teachers, and had about twice as many students. And this camp is a week of professional development with the teachers and then a week of coding with the kids. And you can imagine we could talk for 8 hours about all the things that we've done in this camp. I'm just going to talk about a little bit. First of all, let me see, I maybe have gone through all of this. Oh, so what we were working on with kids is visual art. So they could think about, so for example, we looked at Andy Warhol's work and said, well, what does color do for to communicate an idea? How can we play with color to think about saying something with art? Or we looked at pointillism and thought about the ways that pixelation of images helps you see things with greater or less acuity. So we were making connections between visual art and the kinds of things that you can play with in programming. And then as the week went on, we got to more sort of animated images. So in both years, actually, kids got really interested in stop motion animation and developed these stop motion animation movies using NetLogo, which is the programming environment that we chose to use for this grant, for a variety of reasons. One is because NetLogo, so you can use a block-based kind of programming language like Scratch, or you can use a language kind of programming, which is sort of more typical. And NetLogo uses actual syntax where you write things out. So there's a little bit of evidence that shifting from block-based to language-based programming languages can be a challenge, and so we thought, well, we'll go with language-based. Also, NetLogo, and I'll show you in a minute, lends itself really well to playing with images. So it was like a double advantage. And then the third advantage is that my co-PI for the grant is Corey Brady, and Corey did a postdoc in the lab that developed NetLogo, so he's like extra knowledgeable about it, which turned out to be very useful because we modified NetLogo quite a bit for our grant. So kids worked on their own projects all week long. We had curricula, for sure. We had different models we had them explore. We had a lot of different activities, but ultimately the task was to make a thing that you think is cool. That was all they had to do. They made lots of things they thought were cool, and then the very last day we had, in both years, we had a gallery walk that parents were invited to where they could share what they had done. And kids got to decide what they wanted to share. Some shared 12 things, some shared 1 thing. Parents were, like, in both years, blown away by what their kids could do in a week. They did really amazing things. So, one thing that I want to talk about is what happened when we, or what we think is happening when we make math a little bit more explicit in the programming environment. So in the first year in art and coding camp, there was a lot of mathematical thinking that was available, but we never really talked about it. So if you look at this model, this is the NetLogo canvas, and if you want to try to talk to parts of the canvas, you have to communicate with it based on the coordinate plotting. So that, this might be actually 0, 0 right in the middle. And so we put a lot of, and you can see we have inequalities in here. In other models, it would say P X core or P Y core. So there were concepts that were relevant to mathematics, nobody ever really talked about it other than using these mathematical ideas as labels. They had to actually think about math to do things. So if they wanted to talk about, like, well, I want to make a stripe. In order to make a stripe, you have to talk about all of the x's, right, along here in order to make a stripe happen. So they were doing a lot of mathematical thinking, but it was completely backgrounded. And I want to show you, so I'm going to show you 2 clips today, and they're both from a debugging activity that we did in the 2 years, which was you give a kid a problem, it's a broken model. Can you fix the broken model? And they would work on these, like, I'm going to show you 1 minute of a 40-minute clip, but what I want you to pay attention to is what you think the child is noticing or not noticing that's mathematically relevant in this clip. And you're just going to see him click. In theory, you're going to see him click. Not playing. Let's try it. There we go. So let me pause. So this model is supposed to be a big white square. And as you can see, it makes a big stripe. So the question is, can you fix it? Right? Can you fix it so it makes a white square? So in order to do that, so this button is what's making the stripe happen, and he's editing the button to see if he can figure out how to make it work better.
There was a pile of them that made it.
There they are.
Okay, so did everyone see what you did first? Okay. So you made px core greater than 50 and less than 50, and nothing turned white, right? Okay. Okay. This goes on for more than 20 minutes.
So you're recording
Screen capture, yeah.
for all the kids, or
For all the kids from whom they have permission, yeah.
are you also like interviewing them at any time to see what sense they're making of what they're doing?
Well, so this year, no, but the stories that, so this year, when we did this debugging activity, we developed it on the fly in the middle of the camp because the kids don't seem to know what they know, right? We need to help them know what they know. So that was the whole point, and this was, we didn't even like plan to use this as a source of data really, except that the screen capture software is always on, and it's like, you know, too bad, because actually it's become one of our most powerful sources of data. We were much more intentional in year 2, but in year 1 we did not specifically interview them. However, it's kind of amazing what you can ultimately see, because so this goes on for 20 minutes, actually just this one, and they do 6 different models. So I would love to know, in year 2 we did talk to them a lot more, because then we had already watched these, we're like, oh my god, what is going on? But what's happening here is what we see in literally probably 90% of the debugging models from year 1, which is a lot of exploration about how to fix things in ways that did not seem like kids were attuned to anything that was kind of relevant to the specific mathematical ideas. And we're actually writing a paper about this for ICLS. We have other debugging models that don't involve mathematics, like when you're trying to change colors or change the ways that these objects called turtles move. And they don't do the same, recreating the same mistake over and over that doesn't make sense. So it feels like there's something about the mathematics that's really tripping kids up. So in year 2, we use same net logo model, but we changed some things. So we said, I think we need to really, in the meantime, one of our math teachers had used this curriculum in her honor 7th grade math class too, like of her own accord. That wasn't our plan, but we were thrilled. And it helped us to learn a lot about how, if you're in a math class and you just talk about math, like a lot of great things can come up in the same activity. So we tried to make the mathematics much more salient to everyone. And we made a different model. There's some interesting complexities in computing environments that are different from graphical environments, right? So in particular, like 0 has width in these environments, which can be a little bit tricky. So we thought a lot about the representation of things. But what happens is that kids in this space have very few buttons that they can just press. They have to do a lot more coding, and they're immediately attuned both through the activities that we've done and through the model that this is a coordinate grid. And they talk about coordinates from the very first day. So one thing that happened is that math got talked about, right? So in year 1, even though kids were doing things that were mathematically relevant, in year 2, because we asked them to and because it happened naturally, everybody just talked about particular mathematical concepts a lot of the time. And it really felt like it was an opportunity to rethink about mathematical ideas. And I just want to show a contrast of the way a kid in year 2 approached the same activity at the same point. This is the first thing he opened. And just to look at the difference in attunement from those 2 kids. So this one's a little harder to see, so I put some subtitles, which I think helped a little bit. Come on. There we go. So that's the code that's up there. The F matches with PX score is greater than -5, and PX score is less than 5 is set to color white. So that's what you see up there.
So when you find
So one difference, because now I've watched these videos 300 times each, is the pause. So I don't know if you noticed, but in the previous video, he opened the edit button and he immediately clicked and changed. We see that in every single video in year 1, they click and change. It's a real trial and error kind of approach. This kid, and this happens much more often, is sitting. He's looking. We have better screen capture software in year 2 also, so we can see like he's not sitting because he's talking to his friend. He's sitting and looking at the screen. And this child, I picked him because he actually sometimes says things, which is really, helpful. But that's what he's doing. He's looking at that code.
got to change something. The setup's fine. The client really doesn't care about the setup. The client just wants that square in the middle and not clear up and down. So there's something wrong in the code. Code E in the code.
Whoops. We've lost the signal. There we go.
Okay, well. PX funding.
So this also went on for a while because he didn't solve the problem right away. This is a tricky debugging thing. You have to add a bunch of code to solve it. But what was striking to us about year 2 versus year 1 was the attunement the kids had to the mathematics of the models and the way they were able much more quickly to think about, how is the problem that's being solved, that's being created here, what does the problem that's being created here have to do with where things are in the coordinate plot, or like inequalities. So they did make fewer mistakes, but it wasn't only that they made fewer mistakes, it's that they noticed things about math and thought about math much more than in year 1. So on the one hand, this is like wildly unsurprising. Like, we had kids talk about math, and then lo and behold, they thought about math. Like, hooray! But on the other hand, it suggests to us that first of all, the computing environment was like a lot of value added for kids, right? So that they, even though kids in their pretest all knew how to locate plots in a coordinate grid, they did not immediately know how to think about the coordinate grid in a way that helped them create designs, right? So that was a very different way of thinking about points on a graph, how you make a line, how you make like a whole portion of a graph, how you communicate with a whole portion of the graph. All of those were ideas that ostensibly they knew, but didn't really seem to know when it came time to use it for programming. And so one of the things that we're thinking about as next steps is that integrating math, first of all, seems largely unproblematic for kids. So in a lot of the work I do, which is about out-of-school spaces, people are like, don't talk about the math. Like in the textile artwork or in the playful mathematics learning work, a lot of the time people say if you tell kids they're doing math, they won't want to do it anymore. And we didn't see that at all. Kids were like, great, let's talk about math. It had a total use for them. There was no resistance at all. We also noticed that this programming context actually asked students to think about math again or differently. It really felt like they were encountering these ideas for the first time, even though they could tell you some facts that would make you think they understood these ideas. And that was most interesting to me was that this activity inherently became a problem-solving activity for them. There was no resistance to that at all. And in lots of my other work with math, it's really hard to get kids to persist. It's really hard to get kids to take on their own agency in problem solving. This was like a no-brainer for kids in this environment. So in this sense, I was like a real skeptic initially of like, well, should we even be putting computing into math classrooms? I'm not so sure. This is one thing that felt really, really promising to me. Not like always, but at least in this context, that there was something really important about kids' use of mathematical ideas in these spaces that seems to, I mean, we're still doing analysis, seems to add to the kinds of mathematical thinking they're able to do. What do we have, 45 minutes?
We have 7 minutes.
7 minutes. Well, right now, 45 minutes left. Okay. People have questions about this because I can also talk about identity. Okay, I'll go on to talk about identity really quickly. Just want to share a little bit about the ways that math contributed to computer science. So there's this kind of bi-directional interplay in this work. So because I actually don't know anything about computer science, as we were designing these, and by the way, computer science doesn't know anything about identity in kids, if you look for it. We used what we know about identity development in math to think about the kinds of activities we designed for these kids. And because this is just the way I think about it, we really thought about multiple points of design, like of interaction and design when we tried to create these activities. So we, drawing from the math ed literature, really focused on kinds of norms and practices that emphasized making mistakes, that emphasized communication, that emphasized exploring. We wanted to really be clear that we tried really hard to make sure that we never called out kids who happened to solve something quickly or who happened to have prior knowledge. We didn't have very many, but happened to have prior knowledge so they thought about something in a really clear way. Instead, we made a big production about kids, the creativity of kids' ideas or the innovativeness of kids' ideas. And then, hold on, I'm just getting through some codes here. There we go. And that helped them think about smartness and thoughtfulness based on the kinds of things that they created, right? So kids were constantly looking at each other's activities and being inspired by their activities. And then finally, we thought about how do we offer narratives for kids about who does computer science. So in the field of computer science, if you Google computer scientist, you still see the same kind of thing that you see in math or science if you Google. And it tends to be a person, usually a white man by himself at a computer, which actually is not what computer science looks like anyway, but nevertheless, those are the stereotypes. And so we thought a lot about, like, well, what do the adults who are helping you look like? So we tried really hard to have, there were lots of women in the room, there were, 2 of our teachers were African American, and so we tried to just not have it be, like, we didn't hire a bunch of undergraduate computer science majors. Like, we really tried to make the role models be a little bit different. So one of the things I want to share is what happened for kids, and this is just one kid, and just to see how the design sort of play out in kids thinking about themselves and about the enterprise. So this is a final interview with a child named Eric, and so the interviewer asked, well, what's one thing you made this week that you were proud of? And he talks about the moving dunk that he did, which was like Michael Jordan, like images of Michael Jordan, that it was like a stop motion animation that had him dunking. I made it on the computer, it was really hard, and whenever it was difficult, I didn't give up, and I just kept asking for help and trying to explain how I'd be able to do something, and I eventually got to do it. Nice, so what's something that was really frustrating this week? Making the dunk. The camera flashed at different angles, it was the most difficult. And the interviewer said it was. How did you overcome that challenge? And he said, I kept asking. I kept trying different possibilities until I found the right one. And this is like a very typical comment from kids where they said that they could all tell you something that was really hard and frustrating. There was a lot that was really hard and frustrating. But it was also accompanied by a story of, and then I figured it out, and then I did it, or then I asked someone for help. So it wasn't frustration did not shut them down. We also asked kids about, we tried to do a kind of like social network mapping of our 28 kids or whatever. You know, like who do you ask for help? Who's good at math? I mean, who's good at programming? And so we asked, who do you ask for help? And then has anyone asked you for help? So he says, well, Matt asked me for help, and LaRon asked me for help. And the interviewer said, so how did it make you feel for Matt to ask you for help? Because he was on that list of people that you went to for help. And he said, I'm just happy, like I get to help because I feel like they know everything there is to coding even though this is their first time doing it. And he said, but I got to help and I felt great about it. So and this was another really consistent theme from our kids. In fact, when we looked at that nomination of who's good at computer science, every single kid in the class was nominated by someone else. So we didn't have the kind of consistent things that you find typically where everybody's really good at identifying like the Robins in the room. Like, no. Everybody was in the highest level reading group from their perspective. Everyone had something to offer. And then finally, the thing that was really interesting to us was about the ways that kids started to think about what was different about camp and programming from their everyday experience in school. So the interviewer asked, how do you think camp went? And he said, I thought it went very well, because I got to formulate ideas, and I'm going to use that website, that's our website, all the time now. And the interviewer said, was it what you were expecting when you signed up? Not exactly. I thought it was going to be, I knew I would get to do art, but I didn't know it was going to be this cool. I didn't expect it to be this cool, and the teachers are really nice to you. I didn't get along with many teachers before, and now I do. So it helped me to get along with teachers better too. I'm not a bad kid. And this is an analysis that we've not started yet, but teachers said the exact same thing. They said, well, after the camp, they said, how did it go? What did you think? And they said, it was amazing. And many of the teachers actually knew these kids. It was amazing how much we learned about kids in this camp, like how capable they were, how surprising it was, how much the teachers enjoyed hearing, having space and time to hear about their kids' thinking. And so I will also say when we asked kids, I've done a lot of design studies in my time, I've never had something like this happen where we asked kids on an end of camp survey, what'd you think? They all thought it was great. They thought that coding was fun. They thought it was fun but hard. It was interesting. It was rewarding. So there was a really positive kind of experience with this camp. And in fact, when we asked them, well, are you going to do this again? Basically, they had really positive things to say about computer science. Now, as a person who has designed very similar things in math, this has been amazing to me, right? So we've got a bunch of kids who say, that was really hard. I loved it. We could all be good at it. I definitely want to persist again. This is for me. And so for me, the interrelation between the kinds of things that we know from math ed, which influenced what we did in computer science, and the sort of natural practices and affordances of the programming environment led to a set of outcomes that's exactly what we're constantly trying to get in math. So in fact, what we saw is that for the kids in both summers, mistakes were basically unproblematic. Not that they didn't ask for help, they did, but we didn't see kids shut down and give up. As I mentioned, students thought everyone is capable of coding. And in fact, sometimes they'd say that people were helpful because they had good ideas, and sometimes they were helpful because they could help me solve problems, but there was no difference in those kinds of helpfulness. And most importantly, and the thing that I still don't totally understand, but is our next area of research, is this persistence. We have kids persisting on those debugging activities for 40 minutes sometimes. Kids came back early from lunch because they were loving it so much. And so, what I showed you was kind of typical, right? It's not, sometimes they were perseverating on some of the same problems. So, there's a lot of literature out there about productive failure, and, so we're trying to really understand what's happening in these spaces where kids are working for ages, sometimes without making a lot of noticeable progress, and yet still finding it really fulfilling. And it's the tinkering often that seems to push them into ultimately finding a solution. So I'll pause there. Ooh, I ended at 45 minutes. So these are all members of the research team who have worked to develop these activities and collect data. And then I'll just open it for any questions you have.
So one question I have is, what were the teachers' role in this camp? I know they did the PD, but did they get to modify or adapt the material?
Yes. So good question. So we had, it was a little bit different in the 2 years, but both years it went something like this. We spent the first day and a half just playing with NetLogo as learners. And we had developed a huge number of activities that we had imagined doing with the camp, for the camp. So a day and a half essentially of pure NetLogo play, another day of playing through collectively some of the activities we had designed, and then the rest of the time teachers modified the activities and planned what they wanted to do for the week. And so this is based on some like other projects that I've done. There's a kind of, if you're not scripting the lessons, which we're not, there's a kind of in-between space that seems most productive for teachers in my experience, which is that you give them a set of materials and a set of resources and then ask them to personalize them. In year 2, unsurprisingly, so in year 1, what they were personalizing was like the kind of the activities that went around the NetLogo models we had developed. They asked for a couple of tweaks to the NetLogo models, but it was really about how we introduce it or when we introduce it. In year 2, when we had returning teachers, 2 of whom had actually used some of the activities all year long, I can't fix one thing in NetLogo, Corey does all the NetLogo stuff, so they would call Corey and be like, we need a different model, like we need the model to do this. So there was, I mean, that made sense, right? They understood much more, they had seen their kids use it. So there was, I would say, more kind of empowered change that the teachers were doing in year 2. But in both years, we made stuff and asked them to modify it. And they shared in the interviews, especially just this past summer, how much they appreciated that model because they didn't have to invent things, but they could also do the things that they felt would work best. And then they taught the camp. We didn't teach the camp. So I would say we resourced the camp because we didn't assume that math teachers who'd had 2 days of experience with NetLogo were going to be able to follow kids' design thinking. You know, so what we had was 2 teachers who ran everything, and then we had other people in the room who could help kids when they were working on NetLogo because we didn't want teachers to kind of, we know from math that sometimes when they're insecure about what they know, they revert to more procedural kind of, we didn't want any of that to happen. So it was really easy to say, if a kid wants to do a thing in NetLogo that you're not sure how to do, that's why we're here. Not me, I'm useless. But that's why other people are here to help them think through those ideas. But we didn't teach or lead any activities, we're just kind of assistants in the room.
It seems like all these practices that you're discussing, like trying to avoid sending the message that mistakes are a bad thing, that different kinds of competencies are valued, that it's important to persist, and these are very similar to the types of practices that we try to instill with our teachers in teaching mathematics, right? Like a different version of mathematics that kind of goes back to your very early slide in which we try to challenge and interrupt the cultures and practices of involving one right answer and a set of procedures. And I'm just wondering, like, it seems like it was so successful in this computer programming environment, it almost makes me wonder if it's because so far in our school curriculum, computer programming doesn't have all this cultural baggage that math has. Kind of like, but that's just my guess. Have you thought about the reasons why?
So this is why, like, especially because I keep saying I really don't personally know very much about computer science or programming, and I'm not sure that I actually want to really learn. But it's hard for me to keep out of it because it is so clear how we've damaged decades. I mean, my textile art project is with adults, and like heartbreaking stories of the things that happen to people. And so it could so easily happen in computer science, right? So we're taking a discipline that has a lot of the same sort of potential affordances for proceduralizing, emphasizing accuracy, all this crap. That is actually, I mean, my husband is also a programmer, right? So I can tell, like, so that's not what professional programmers do. Yeah. They like steal each other's stuff all the time. Right. They're even called stealing, right? That's just what you do when you're a programmer. So we could do that same harm. And in fact, I actually think programming or computer science more broadly is a much more powerful discipline in terms of living our lives and running our lives than mathematics is even. And so it's really troubling to me that we could ultimately replicate the same kinds of mistakes we've made in math ed in a discipline that then actually involves like the way we live our lives, right? Those phones or whatever those devices are like a significant lens in our world, and who's making those lenses is really troubling to me. So I do think that, so this question of like, is it just that we haven't messed them up yet?
Yeah.
Is I think is something I wonder about, partly why I want to be involved. But I also think that possibly it's not that dire, right? So there's something about the programming environment that's really different about math in that there's a constant kind of feedback that you're getting about your ideas and about your thinking that you don't actually need. We could also have a much more benign interpretation about what has happened in math, which is that teachers are just really, all of us, just love our kids and we want them to feel successful. And our way of supporting their success is to not make them feel bad and to not make things feel uncomfortable. And so we step in right away. You don't have to step in here. The environment is pushing back all the time, right? The environment is telling you that it was wrong. You change that thing, now you get no right square. You change it back, now you've got a strike. We don't need to intervene quite as soon. And I wonder about whether the environment itself could help ameliorate some of the issues we've had.
I mean, I'm thinking about just the other direction and learning those kinds of lessons to inform and infuse the way we think about mathematics. Because in many of our task designs, we now have the technology and ability and creativity in designing activities and lessons in which, in mathematics, just like in computer science, the task itself can provide that kind of feedback, right? So, that's a lot of the work we do in trying to kind of make school mathematics more human for the students. So it's intriguing to me because it does seem like we can kind of think about this as a bi-directional relationship and think about the lessons we learn from these experiences and how to infuse mathematics, but it does seem so complex because we are dealing with the kind of cultural damage that we've inflicted on everybody in terms of math teaching.
Yeah, no,
I don't want to see computer science look like that in 30 years. As soon as there's a standardized test tied to it, then I feel like we're screwed.
That's right, agreed. I will say that, so one of our teachers are two years of teaching who used this curriculum with her honors 7th grade class. So first of all, why honors? Because she didn't have to worry about their test scores.
Yeah.
And this particular teacher has been a teacher for 25 years, so she nobody's gonna bug her. And Nashville is like very high stakes, like everybody bugs everyone, but nobody was gonna bug her. And she, so she had a lot of authority at the school, at the district, and she was working with 7th grade honors. But I will say that even she was amazed about so she had code Fridays. So we did whatever we did usually Monday through Thursday, and then on Fridays they got to code in that logo. And she was really amazed at how different her kids were on Fridays. And so, if I were going to imagine how this computer science infusing into math could happen, which is actually not that different from how shifts to reform teaching happen, is to sort of demonstrate possibilities to teachers. And I don't actually think that we do want to shift to a full-on integration model, but I think strategic integration is actually probably could be very powerful. But yes, we have many of these.
I'm not a math educator. I'm not in math education. I'm actually in the generic jack of all trades, learning, design, and technology. But I have a math teacher background, and the things that you're saying are very amazing and exciting to me. These are things I would want to do with teachers. So my question is not so much about the project, but the theoretical. Suggestions for somebody who's an outsider trying to dip a toe in the water in, maybe peel back the hood a little, what's informing what you're doing, and theoretically speaking, and what advice might you have for someone who's trying to dip a toe in this water?
What we're doing with teachers or what we're doing with kids or both?
Let's go with kids.
Okay. So what we're doing with kids is about what would be theory. So if I was to attach a particular theory to it, it would be ecological psychology. Because what we think about is the ways that tasks and practices attune people to particular kinds of ideas and how that attunement sort of affords not so sort of, how those designs kind of afford different kinds of relationships with the material. And so in other projects, we've spent an enormous amount of time thinking about, like, what are the potential, what is this task doing? Like, how does it create opportunities to engage in a particular way? How does it position people relative to one another? So like positioning theory, et cetera, which goes beautifully with ecological psychology, those are the kinds of theoretical perspectives we use, because we see what happens to kids as having very little to do with kids, actually, but having everything to do with their experiences. So that's obviously that's an extreme version. Obviously we think kids bring something to the picture, but we find in general that focusing on the environment seems to be a more powerful design framework than trying to focus on the kid. So I would say those, that's like a bazillion theories, right? But that's a broad range of theories. I will say that in my experience so far, computer science education does not have a lot to offer us in terms of designing things. So actually, Florence Sullivan and I are co-editing a special issue of Computer Science Education. Papers are due on Thursday. That is about participation in computer science. And by participation, we mean kind of the Lehman-Wenger version of participation. Participation is learning. Because if you look, it's very hard to find any articles of the type we have just reams of in math ed about what you do in this task. And we have tasks, we have norms. I don't need to tell you, we have a lot in math ed that really help us to think about why kids do what they do. We have very little in computer science ed that help us think about that. And we can borrow, I borrow all the time, but actually it's different, right? The disciplines have different histories, the activities actually have really different affordances, so we have to start to develop a research base that is specific to the computer science content as well. But that's what I draw from is like the math ed kind of stuff with an assumption, with a focus on environment.
Can you, just one follow-up question, about the positioning theory? Can you tell me more about that? The ecological psychology I'm good with. That one caught my attention.
So, yes, I love positioning theory. So, Perret and Van Langenhove, Ron Perret, and forgot his name, Van Langenhove, years ago, decades ago, they're social psychologists, linguists, something. They thought a lot about the ways that we position one another through our talk. So it's a way to think about, and then that idea has been taken up widely by people who look at interaction, especially in math ed. Not that I'm biased, but math ed often pushes a lot of these envelopes, the way we think about learning, more than some of the other disciplinary scholarship does. But so the way people have started to think about it is so you can think about it really easily, right? So you are positioning me right now with authority because you're asking me questions as if I know something that might be valuable to you, right? And I am accepting that positioning and being like, yeah, I know that thing, I'm going to tell you, right? So it's a mutual positioning of me in this moment as having a kind of expertise. And we position one another in interaction all the time. And sometimes we position one another or we attempt to position one another and we reject that bid, right? So somebody might say, that's a dumb idea. And you say, are you kidding me? How could you say that to me? Right? As opposed to, that's a dumb idea, and I say, oh, I guess you're right. Right? So those different interactions are actually serving to position the interlocutors, the people in the conversation, in really different ways. So those ideas that came out of really just trying to understand how we make sense of one another through interaction have gotten pulled into a lot of work on thinking about learning. So we think about the way the tasks position someone relative to the content. So you can think of Mary Kay Stein's task framework in this way. So how is the task at all? It wasn't just Mary Kay, but how does the task itself position the learner relative to the kind of mathematical thinking that they're offered, that they're asked to do, right? So in that way, we think about this relationship between person and task in essence. So if you look up, in fact, it has been such a popular concept in math ed that Beth Herbel-Eisman and her team wrote a kind of a sort of review of positioning theory in math ed, which is really kind of useful, which I can send to you as a kind of overview. But that's the idea. I find that idea really powerful, obviously, since I just talked about it for 5 straight minutes.
Yeah. And so is that related? So I've gone the embodied cognition route, so Goodwin and his work around social interaction, is it related to that?
Yeah, I would say so. Right now we're really interested in Goodwin's idea of professional vision as we're trying to make sense of how kids learn about debugging. So professional vision is the idea that if you have experience with a discipline, you start to notice different things than you do. It's a different way to think about expertise, actually. It's a kind of attunement as expertise as opposed to knowledge as expertise. And he uses analysis of archaeologists to make that claim. But you can think about professional vision across any kind of thing, including debugging, right? So it turns out if you know something, the more you know about NetLogo, the better able you are to identify what a problem might be, right? And you can think about that as a kind of emergent expertise, but it's clearly perceptual as well as sort of knowledge-based, right? Because what do you see, what do you notice, what jumps out at you? Those are all things about professional vision. So yeah, it's definitely related.
Thank you.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just curious to ask, what is the distinction between, that you and Vicky make between narratives and frames? Okay, sorry. I could read the paper, I guess.
No, you can read it in the paper, but I would say that most because Vicky, that paper, oh my God, that paper. So here's how we ended up thinking about it. It was like months of thinking. So frames are narratives as they are realized in interaction. It's very concise. So they're not, you can't really separate them. You can't have a frame without a narrative, but just because narratives exist doesn't mean that it will end up being relevant in the space you're in. So that's sort of how we think about the distinction. So frames like, and the people who study frames will really talk about the way frames get made meaningful in interaction, right? So something can cue a frame, for example. And something can only cue a frame if you have experience, like, and there's something that you're drawing on in order for the frame to become relevant, but it might not become relevant. So like, speed was just not cued. Like, there was lots of potential for kids to care about speed in this classroom because they kept like working on the same thing over and over again. And you can see times when a kid would notice what another kid was doing and they had moved on. And you could see, like if we wanted to do an analysis of frames in our classes, we would be able to see times where school frames or speed frames could have snuck in and did kind of rear their ugly heads, but they didn't actually get to take over. But that would be, so why would speed matter? Why would speed make you feel anxious? Well, that's about the broader narrative about what speed communicates, right? So that's how we thought about that distinction. That paper, just lesson in persistence. I mean, we wrote that paper, the reviewers hated it for lots of different reasons. So totally different reasons. So then we completely rewrote the paper and resubmitted it. And the reviewer was like, I really like the first version better. And that second reviewer was like, I give up on you, you don't understand me at all. And so now it's actually something we were really proud of, but oh my God, luckily we're friends because it was awful.
I think we are running out of time.
Okay, can I say one thing?
Yeah, sure.
ICLS 2020! If you do not know about the International Conference of the Learning Sciences, you should. It is about the ways that people study learning, how they think about teaching, how they think about environment design. It's going to be in Nashville this summer, and submissions are due November 18th. If you have questions about it, you can always email me, or if you just email ICLS 2020 at Vanderbilt, that will also get to a team of people. But the theme of this year's ICLS is the interdisciplinarity of learning sciences, because we're really trying to broaden and highlight the ways that multiple ways of thinking about studying learning in different disciplines from different perspectives productively come together. So even if you haven't submitted before, this is your year. Okay, now I'm done.
Thank you very much.